We're going to do a little video here on per capita and scaling. So remember that per capita means per one person. So we are going to work on this table here in just a minute. But first things first, which country has the most licensed Starbucks? So looking at this column here, most licensed Starbucks is here, which would be the U.S. I don't think that's surprising to any of us that we have the most Starbucks locations. But which country has the largest population? Well, population deals with this column. So we look down, China has the largest population. So they have the most people, they do not have the most Starbucks. Can we make a meaningful comparison between two countries regarding the commonality of Starbucks without taking the population into consideration? Why or why not? Now, the short answer is no. The long answer is, you can word this a ton of different ways, but think about it. We would assume that the more people you have, the more Starbucks you would have. That makes sense logically. But you can see China has less than half of the number of Starbucks locations of the U.S., even though they have way more people. So you can't just say, oh, the U.S. has the most Starbucks, so they must have the biggest population. Not necessarily. So Starbucks and the population, we have to think of them hand in hand. We have to talk about both of them and to see how they relate. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to calculate the licensed Starbucks locations per capita. So we're going to talk about Starbucks over people for the rest of the country, and we're going to fill in the table. So we're going to do the U.S. together. So number of Starbucks in the U.S. is 6,530. The number of people is 325.7 million. And we know that million is times 10 to the 6th. So you can type that into your calculator, and you can move the numerator into scientific notation if you want. If we did that, we would get 6.53 times 10 to the 3rd over 3.257 times 10 to the 8th. Because again, this goes over 2, so that goes up by 2. However you do it, whatever. Let me change color real quick. These two columns are the same, but one is in scientific notation, one is as a decimal. So when we calculate this fraction here, I end up with 2.00 times 10 to the negative 5th. And that is the same as 0.00002. Right, there's 4 zeros there. So those two columns are the same, they're just written differently, and depending on your calculator, some calculators spit out standard form, some spit out scientific notation. You have to be able to move between them. Okay, so that means there are 0.00002 Starbucks per person in the U.S. Well, that doesn't make any dang sense, and that leads us to this last column. Okay, so let me give me some work room here at the bottom. Starbucks rate per 100,000. Now, the rate that we have now is per one person, and we want this to be per 100,000 people, right? So we're trying to figure out what this value is. Well, think about that. If we take 1 and we multiply by 100,000, that gives us 100,000. So I'm going to take my per capita value and multiply by 100,000, and that will give me this value. So for the U.S., the value is 2. So for every 100,000 people in the U.S., there are 2 Starbucks locations. So I always try to compare that to like the Michigan football stadium, because a big college football stadium holds about 100,000 people. So you'd think, okay, so for every time Michigan football stadium is full, there are 2 Starbucks locations for those. I'd be willing to bet there's more than 2 Starbucks locations in Michigan football stadium, but that's just me. Okay, I want you to hit pause, try the other 3 countries, and then come back and double check your answers. All right, so coming back and checking it out, you'll see that China and South Korea both have scientific notations with an exponent of -6, which leads to a per 100,000 of less than 1. You're looking at their decimals, they have 5 zeros after the decimal point instead of just 4, like the United Kingdom and the United States, and Canada, if we want to consider them. So this is what our completed table looks like. So now let's go ahead and use the number of Starbucks per capita for the United States in a meaningful sentence. Okay, well, the United States per capita is here. So using that in a sentence, there are 0 point, I need 4 zeros and a 2, Starbucks per person in the U.S. And that just doesn't make any sense. I mean, for every one person, there's 0.00002 Starbucks. It doesn't make sense. We can't comprehend what that means. Is that a lot? Is that not a lot? You don't know because of that number. So that is why we use this last column of per 100,000, because then we can actually understand what that means. So let's go ahead and use the Starbucks per 100,000 for South Korea in a meaningful sentence. So that's this number. So there are 0.612 Starbucks for every 100,000 people in South Korea. Now you might say, well, Becky, that still doesn't make sense because you're at 0.6 Starbucks. You can't have 0.6 of a Starbucks. You either have the whole thing or you don't. And that is true. And that leads us to the next question of, is the rate per 100,000 people an ideal scale for every country? Well, no, because China and South Korea are both under 1 when you're talking about per 100,000. So when you're talking about a scale, you want a scale that's going to allow the number in front of the decimal to be greater than 0. Right? Doesn't matter what it is, but if you have a 0, you have less than 1, it doesn't make any sense. So no, because we have things that are less than 1. So what would be a better scale for both China and South Korea? Well, we only need to go one more decimal place. So if I only need to go one more decimal place, I just need to go one more. I need to add one more 0. So that would give me per 1 million would be better, because that would move it over. If I would take my China, which is 0.000002, and multiply that by 1 million, that would give me 2. So therefore, there are 2 Starbucks for every 1 million people in China. Okay, so think about this. In Indianapolis, there are roughly, a little over 800,000 people. So there's not even 1 million people. I have a friend who lives in Indy. She has 2 Starbucks on the opposite corners of her apartment. So she goes right a block, she has a Starbucks. Goes left a block, she has a Starbucks. So there's not even 1 million people in Indianapolis, and there's 2 Starbucks within 2 blocks of each other. And I don't think those are the only 2. So it's very, very crazy to think of the difference between the U.S. and China. Right? They have 2 per 1 million people. We have 2 within 2 city blocks. All right. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to rank. So you're going to do 3 rankings. First is by population, and we're going low to high. Then by the number of Starbucks locations, and then by the Starbucks per capita. And let's go ahead and use the per 100,000 because we used that information, so it'll be easier. Okay, so let's do those 3. I'm going to hit pause. I'm going to write them out, and then, let's discuss the differences. See if you can notice any big differences between those. All right, so by population, Canada's the smallest, China's the largest. In terms of Starbucks, South Korea has the fewest number of Starbucks, the U.S. has the most. And then per capita, China is the smallest, Canada is the largest. And looking at like weirder things, right? Canada has the smallest overall population, but the largest Starbucks per capita. And vice versa. China has the largest population, but the smallest Starbucks per capita. And everybody else is kind of in the middle. These 3 in the middle here are the same order. So it's just very interesting. While Canada has the largest per capita Starbucks per capita, they don't have the biggest number of Starbucks. So that's where it really comes into play, where you have to pay attention to how many people you have, because it does matter.